Thank you very much, and a great film. Reminded me of the Eurovision Song Contest. I don't know whether you saw some of those videos, but they were very much in line with that. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk tonight. I love coming to Copenhagen. I have family and friends here, and I also have a guest position at the University of Copenhagen, so it's always wonderful to come here. So I'm going to talk tonight about the 21st century, which potentially is the last century of young people. And I will draw on my book, How Population Change Will Transform Our World. But I'm also going to draw on a variety of research. I run a research institute at Oxford, which looks at population change. And the important thing is we're very multi and interdisciplinary. So I started in anthropology, I then moved into demography, and in my institute we have economists and statisticians, we have medical people and biologists, and we have psychologists, and increasingly we have people who work in the environmental space around climate change, because I think that's a really important message. We have basically one planet. This is our planet. For a while, we thought we were the masters of the planet and everybody else was there to serve us. Now we realize we are just one species of many living on this planet. But without any doubt, the population growth that we have and the increased consumption that we have is really altering our planet. And so the size of our planet and how much we consume is incredibly important. And what I'm going to talk tonight is something that, in a way, is quite extraordinary. It's the changing population, the fact that the population isn't necessarily always going to grow, it may start to decline, but the amount of governments, particularly here in Europe and in other high-income countries, that are wanting to get us to increase our population, that we live in a world where we cannot get out of our heads the fact that we should always be having lots of young children, a growing population, growing economies. And the 21st century isn't necessarily going to be like that, and governments have got to work to address this. So let's start the story. We're here in a wonderful concert hall as a multi- and interdisciplinary research institute. Me and my colleagues often work with people from the humanities, and so I'm going to mix scientific data, medical data, a little bit of art, and also some sociological, anthropological data, just to build a picture of where we're going over the next century or so. This is how we started 25 years ago. So at the end of the last century, everybody was obsessed with the fact that our population was growing, and how could we stop the world population reaching 24 billion by the end of this century. We're currently about 8 billion. When I was born, we were about 4 billion, so we've doubled in my lifetime. In the next 25 years, we are likely to go to 10 billion, and then probably 12 billion by the end of the century. And what has happened, surprisingly, is we've gone from concerns over overpopulation to this. Concerns that we have hit peak population, and during this century we're going to see a decline in the number of people on the planet. And the concerns are mainly driven from an economic point of view, that our economic model is so dependent on population growth. But we also have philosophers who are diving in and saying, what about all those people who should be born? All those babies and children, those Mozarts and Beethovens and Donald Trumps who should be born. And unless we can keep having babies, they're not going to live. Why did we go in this particular way? Well, the reason this happened was this: dramatic falling fertility. This is from The Economist at the turn of the century. I and my institute also belong to something called the Oxford Martin School, which looks at the 21st century, and it is full of people who think they can predict this century coming. And I always think that people who work in demography, we actually have the tools to be able to give the frame of what is going to happen. Because, of course, all the babies that are being born now, we know roughly how long they're going to live and roughly where they will be living. But we didn't see falling fertility happen as quickly as it has. But people welcomed it at the beginning of this century. Wonderful, we're not going to hit 24 billion. But 25 years later, everyone is concerned about this, the baby bust. I think your Prime Minister, actually, in her New Year talked about the baby bust, talked about how Denmark has got to increase the number of babies. Korea has just set up its first department for encouraging women to have more children. Hungary, France, we can name endless countries that are concerned about this. The baby bust has arrived. Let's look at what exactly is happening, because this is a global phenomenon. And this is something called the total fertility rate. And the total fertility rate is the average number of children that a woman can be expected to have across her reproductive years. And if you look at the yellow, brown, and blue, that is currently those countries which are at, near, or below replacement. So in 2/3 of the world's countries, women are more or less at or below replacement. It isn't just here in Europe. It's throughout Asia, Southeast Asia. It's going into Latin America and North America. And you can see that the red is the only part of the world where we still have very high levels of childbearing. That's between roughly 4 to 9 children on average. Why has this happened, and why has it happened so quickly? Because remember, it's really the last 50, if not 25 years where we've seen these rapid reductions. It's called something called the demographic transition. It started in Europe about 200 years ago. And the basic story is that if you can improve the health, particularly of women and children, so that the children don't die, and therefore the women know that if they're going to have large numbers of babies, they're going to have to bring up large numbers of children. If you can introduce family planning, and importantly, if you can introduce education, particularly secondary education, and particularly for girls, you keep them out of the marriage market so they don't get married very young. You give them skills so that they can go out into the labor market, but most importantly, you empower them, and that's what we have done. We've had tremendous increases, particularly in the developing countries or the global south, so that most girls now have the opportunity to go to secondary school. Not all, but most. And those educated women have decided in Asia and Latin America, and even beginning in Africa, to do what we do, which is to decide how many children we're going to have. So what about what is really now happening? Because we now have gone from that fall from 9 children per woman, which in fact our great-grandparents, or in some cases it would have been your grandparents, would have had 6, 7, 8 children. We've gone right the way down to a population here in Europe where we are well below replacement. We are roughly at about 1.2 in southern and eastern Europe. We're in Western Europe about 1.5, 1.6, and here in Scandinavia we're about 1.85. And we can look at that in a different graph. Throughout these slides, you're going to see this. These are slides which have come out of the Oxford Institute, and that's why they are banded, so I don't have to keep saying, and this slide comes from, etc. So you can see here we have this graph, which starts in the 1950s, where we still had reasonable levels of childbearing here in Europe, and we're comparing Eastern and Southern Europe, which fell very dramatically and has stayed very low, with Northern and Western Europe, which is below replacement, but is slightly higher. And what we've put on here is the red, which is Denmark, and the green, which is Sweden. And you can see Denmark and Sweden, despite what your Prime Minister is concerned about, is actually at around about 1.7, 1.67. If you look at Sweden, there's a very interesting message that we will look at again in a minute, because you can see the ups and the downs. And that very much reflects when governments try to really boost fertility. And what tends to happen is if they offer incentives, women tend to think, oh, well, I wanted to have one, maybe 2 children. I'll have them now and get the incentive. And then, of course, they don't have them in the subsequent years. What is going to be the result of this? And I'm going to show you this graph, which is going to show the vanishing children across the globe. So you need to concentrate particularly on the red and the blue as we go forward, because we're going to start with countries where nearly 50% of their population is under 15, and we're going to run it through the 21st century. So let's start here. This is in 1980, and you can see that it was only really in North America and parts of Russia and Europe where we had less than 15% of our population children, and in huge swathes of the world they were yellow. That means that is over a quarter of the population were children, and it goes right the way up to countries particularly like Afghanistan, Pakistan, where you had half the population under 15. And let's just quickly run that forward and watch the blue come across the globe. 2010, this is roughly 2030 where we are, way into 2050, where the majority, in fact, of the world outside Africa is going to have increasingly fewer young people. And when we get to the end of the century, we can see almost every country in the world is going to have less than 15% of its population as children. We really are transforming our world. We've grown up with this idea of the population pyramid, large numbers of babies being born, death across the life course, but those babies becoming workers and driving our economies, and that is going to stop. So this is some data, but what about understanding the stories from the women's perspective? So with an anthropological team, we have collected vignettes from women trying to understand the decisions that they're making. And I'm just going to choose 3 women, and we're just going to look at their life stories, and we're going to look at the decisions that they made. And we're going to have one from Africa, one from Asia, and one from here in Europe. And we're going to start in Niger. Now, Niger has the highest childbearing rate in the world, still on average 9 children per woman. And we're going to focus on this woman who is called Naga. And the interesting thing is every woman I show you is 40, because we chose 3 women who were all born in the same year but in different parts of the world. And we're going to look at the childbearing that they had. So like many girls in Nigeria, Naga left school after primary school. She was married at 12 to her husband's friend, who was 52. It's quite common, in actual fact, for the fathers to marry their elder daughter to a friend, because to them that is an older man who will protect the daughter. She had her first child at 13. She went on to have 15 pregnancies and 9 live births. And her eldest daughter, she married her daughter at 11, and the daughter died in childbirth. She herself became a grandmother at 27, and she was widowed at 28. And now at 40, she is completely dependent on her her late husband's family, and her entire life is based around the children, the grandchildren, and she's 40 and probably has a life expectancy of another 10 years. And then we can move to a country which is changing very rapidly. This is Malaysia, and this is an interview and a woman that I followed, and she is called Vani. Again, 40, born in the same year as Naga, and she really illustrates that transition that we're seeing. She left school at 14, so she had a little bit of secondary education, and she moved to Singapore, and for 10 years she worked basically as a sort of basic cleaner in an American hotel. She lived in a hostel. And when she was in her late 20s on a trip back to Malaysia to see her family, she was persuaded to get married. And she married a local boy. And when I met her and first interviewed her, she was 33, and she said, I don't know what to do. I really do not want to have children, because if I have children, I'll give up my life here in Singapore. I love being in Singapore. I speak English. I'm now, she was a restaurant maid. But my husband wants me to have children. And when I interviewed her 2 years later, she had a child. And she said, actually, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, because my mother-in-law is bringing up the child. And I said, will you have more children? And she said, no. I will have 1 child, and this will be the best provided for child, but I'm definitely not going to have more than 1 child. She had 8 siblings. So in 1 generation, we had gone from 8 down to 1. And then finally, the really low fertility story. This is Lisa, who comes from Italy. She's 40. At 37, she met her current partner, who's a Chilean. She works currently in London. At 40, she doesn't have children. She's no desire to have children. And she was in a class of 22 in Rome. And of that class, less than 10 have had children. And in fact, if you look at the statistics, she's very, very representative. In Italy as a whole, 22% of 40-year-olds are childless, or child-free, as we would now refer to it. In the UK, it's 19%. Here in Denmark, it's 15% of women aged 40 will probably never have a child. And in Korea, it's 26%. So these stories really represent the data. And one of the things I think is really important is you can take this kind of ethnographic or anthropological material, and you can use it to generate hypotheses, which you can then test in bigger surveys. And the in-depth material and the survey material is telling exactly the same story. So what exactly is going on? One of the things, without any doubt, is the current generation are affected by the economic situation. We know there is, across the globe, real concern about things like employment and housing and the future. And the last few years, particularly with the pandemic, which also had an impact on people's child decisions. But it's actually more than that. And we know that, like Sweden in the 1990s, like Australia in 2000s, like Hungary at the moment, giving young people incentives, economic incentives to have children simply doesn't work. They'll have that child, but it will only be one child. They're not going to go on to have 2, 3, or 4 children. And that's because what our surveys have shown is that across the globe, young women in particular are saying exactly the same thing. They don't want to have children. They have lost what we call the obligation to reproduce. So in my generation, there was still that obligation. We would have children. It was expected that a woman probably, if she could, would have a child. That appears to have gone. And stunningly, it's gone here, it's gone in Korea, it's gone in Japan, it's gone in Hong Kong, it's gone in America. Across the world, the same decisions are being made. And one of the reasons seems to be that we now have very highly educated women who can choose. And those societies where we have gender equality, where they really trust that their employers will not discriminate them against them, where their partners will help them bring up the children, we're seeing a slight increase in the number of children born. But even in somewhere like France, which is throwing money and incentives, or in Sweden, or even here in Denmark, where you have very, very good gender equality, positive parenting, we're not seeing any of these total fertility rates go above replacement. So I think we have to face it as a world that we are going to have fewer children going forward. And remember, still in Africa, we have very, very large childbearing. And one of the demographic solutions, and it's not politically popular, but demographically it's the right thing to consider, is of course that the world demographically can balance through immigration. And that's exactly what some of the European countries, Britain and France, for example, have done. We have exported economic capital to the global south, and we've imported human capital. And that movement of peoples is demographically the solution. But something else, I think, is possibly going on. And part of it is represented by this slide. This shows real concern about the world, about the way that our consumption, here you can see electricity consumption at night. Look how it dominates in the northern hemisphere. So many people are beginning to say, because of climate change, because of the natural environment, I don't want to bring a child for all sorts of reasons into the planet. And in fact, some of you may have seen, if you read The Guardian, that just this week they published a survey of 100 female climate scientists, 20% of which said, we have chosen not to have children because of the climate crisis. I'm starting to panic about my child's future. When I was making my choice, it was clear that in the ecological community, human population growth was a problem, 20%. But let's be a little bit careful, because at the same time we have a scientific journal which also had 100 people, these are not climate scientists, but 100 people of roughly similar, and they were asked exactly the same questions. And I have to say that although they were aware of the climate situation, they said in the end it had little bearing on their decision to have children or not. And that, to me, is a sort of better way to think about this. I do a lot of media broadcasts, and quite often they bring me into a discussion where there's a group of young women who are saying, I don't want to have children because it will damage the planet. And the far better answer is have children, but have children that are low consuming. I think it's very unfortunate if people who want children become so scared of what is happening climate-wise that they tend to step back. But clearly that kind of feeling about being child-free is something. And then, of course, the final thing we also have to consider in this area is the one-child society. I'm sure you're all aware of what happened in China. I don't have to explain that. And that the government is trying to get women to have 2 or 3 children. And it simply isn't working. And the survey material that is coming back is suggesting the reason it isn't working is because they live in a one-child society. You know, why would you want to have more than one child? I'm a one child, my partner's a one child, or my cousins, even my parents in some cases, were one child. Why would I want to have more than one child? So we really are, for all sorts of reasons, changing the structure. But there's a couple of other things I think we should be aware of. And the next thing I'm going to show you comes from biology, and it's very pertinent to Denmark. And this is a survey which really, or a scientific study that really affected how we began to think about the environment and what it was doing to our fertility. So this was a particular study that was done in the 1990s, and they looked by this particular measure at sperm concentration in Danish army recruits. And the green is fertile, the yellow is subfertile, and the red is infertile. They found huge levels of infertility by this measure among young men in Denmark. And it just so happened that there was an identical study done in 1945 in the US on army recruits. And you can see, comparing the low levels of fertility, which is the orange from Denmark, with what was happening in 1945, which is the tall green, where nearly all the men were at complete optimal fertility. And this really was one of those sort of seminal studies where people began to say, it must be the environment. It really must be something in the environment that is causing these levels of infertility. And what people were then concerned about, they thought Denmark is an incredibly environmentally sound country. And if Denmark has this kind of impact on male infertility, maybe that's why we are seeing dramatic fertility falls across Asia and Africa, where environmental pollution is much more prevalent. But they then replicated this study in Finland, and they discovered that actually Finnish men had very, very high scores. So there was something about living in Denmark. And what environmental scientists who've now got involved in some of this analysis believe, it's because I think your water comes from aquifers. And even though I know you try to keep the water clean and all sorts of tests are done on it, it's highly likely that maybe of all the European countries, you have probably more estrogen from plastics, etc., in your water. You hear a lot about the biological causes of why people are not having children. It's clearly there, but I think it's probably quite minor when we look at 8 billion people. And then there's this, and this is, I love this study, this is a fantastic study. This is the number of births in 17 OECD countries. And what they found was there was an exact correlation with storks, stork breeding pairs, because we know storks bring babies. This is, any of you who are teachers, this is a wonderful study to do on your first year statistical students, but maybe it's true. So what is this doing to our population? Let's very quickly whip through some population pyramids to see how they are changing in shape and in different parts of the world. So this is a classic population pyramid, 1990. What you have to look at, we have men on one side, women on the other, and the green are the high-income countries. And you can see that by 1990, we'd more or less just replaced ourselves. If you look at the blue, that is East Asia, the brown, that is South Asia, and the pink, that is Africa. And I want you to look at what's happening at the bottom as we go forward and what's happening to the shape of the pyramid. This is where we are now, and this is where we will be in 25 years. So dramatic change. Look, we have really reduced births in Asia, both in East and in South. We have dramatically increased the number of births that are happening in Africa. But look what's happened to the shape. The shape has been transformed into basically a sort of inverted basin. And if you look at what's happening at the top, the difference at the top between where it is now, instead of there being death across the life course, these people are all still alive. People who demographically would have died, they are alive, and their children are alive, and their grandchildren are alive, and their great-grandchildren are alive. And for the very first time, we are having human population growth not driven so much by fertility, but by falling mortality or longevity. So the aging of the population is also causing population growth. And let's start just to turn and tease out some of those ideas. So this is a map where we have mapped the percentage by age, over 60 by 2050, 25 years' time. And if you look at the red, the blue, and the green, those are the countries that have 20, 25, and 30, or a third roughly, % of their population aged over 60 by 2050, with probably a life expectancy at 60 of another 30 or 35 years. Indeed, by 2060, several European countries, several Asian countries will have half their population aged over 50. Half your population aged over 50. And when I say this, people think, oh my goodness, all those old people. Well, just work out the sums, because by 2060, it's probably many of you people in the room. It's us, you. This is the world that we're going into. How do we adjust our society when we're going to have half our population aged over 50, and potentially half our population aged over 60 by the end of the century? The world is going to change. We have to basically change our policies to accommodate it. So let's quickly look at some individuals. This is the world's first supercentenarian. This is someone who lived till they were 110, and I don't know whether you've got any idea when this person was born. The first person to reach 110. Well, if I say he fought with Napoleon, and that he was born in 1788, and he lived until 1899, he was nearly the first person documented to live in 3 centuries. We've always had long-lived people. This isn't nothing new. It's just that when he was alive, there were probably 10 centenarians in the whole of Europe. So, this is the longest-lived woman. That's Jeanne Comalt of France, the longest-lived documented woman. There are other people, but we have documentation for this. 122, and the oldest verified man was a Japanese man who made it to 116. And currently, the oldest woman is 117. She lives in Spain. She's called Maria. And the oldest man is called John, and he is 111 years old and lives in England. So throughout Europe, we're having these, and Asia, we're having these long-lived people. If I show you this graph, which is called the rectangularization of the life curve, you can see how we go from a few people to the mass aging of our population. So this runs from 1851 to 2011. So the dark line is 1851, 2011. In 1851, in Europe, half the population was dead by the time they were 45. And now we have half our population is going to make it to 80 in Europe. We've really pushed back death across the life course. And particularly, as you can see, It's last century, the 20th century, we really pushed death back. First of all, we did it historically by improving sanitation, by decent food. Then we brought in public health, and we had vaccinations. And now we have things like huge amounts of pharma or drug therapy and geriatric medicine. Those people who think we're all living longer because of medicine, that actually isn't true. We're living longer because we are living healthier lifestyles supported at the end of our lives, maybe by medicine. So what has this done to our population? Let's look at the population level rather than at the individual level. This is life expectancy, men and women aged 60. Life expectancy at birth in Europe is almost meaningless because you can say almost everybody makes it to 60 and half the population makes it to 80. So it's far more interesting to look at life expectancy from aged 60. The dark line are women. The dotted lines are men. Women live longer than men. I'll tell you why in a minute. And you can see right at the top, we have Japan and France. Then we drop down to the UK and to the USA. What is really interesting is that I can understand as an English woman why I have a lower life expectancy than a Japanese woman. It's probably to do with my genetics, almost undoubtedly to do with my lifestyle and my diet. But what's so special about the French? That French women are living so much longer than English women. And I recently was on sabbatical in Paris, and I was talking to the French demographers, and they went, it is not the channel. The channel is not the dividing line. The line goes across the middle of France. Northern French women have the same life expectancy of English women. It's the Mediterraneans. So the Mediterranean, we haven't put Spain on this one, but Spain is up there also with France. The Spanish, the Greeks, the Italians, that Mediterranean lifestyle and diet, we now know at the population level, really, really has an impact. I'll come back to the Mediterranean diet at the end. But we can actually put in Denmark and Sweden. So Sweden is in the green line. Denmark is in the red line. Denmark doesn't do that well. In fact, Denmark is only just above the USA, and the USA does dreadfully in OECD countries. Not really quite sure why, particularly Danish men you can see bumming along at the bottom there, although they do increase a little bit. I don't know why Danish men do so much more worse than the green, which are the Swedish men. Possibly alcohol, possibly smoking, possibly diet. I'm sure you know maybe more than I do about Danish men, but you can also see for the very first time COVID. Can you see particularly at the States, which is the orange one, that COVID dip when we really lost life expectancy? We presume it will go back, though it hasn't gone completely back. France was also affected, the UK was affected. Interestingly, Sweden, which of course did not do lockdown like the rest of us, it had a relatively low dip. But one of the things that you will have seen, as I say, is that women live longer than men. We used to think at one point that it was that as women took on male lifestyles, so they would then start having lower life expectancy, higher morbidity, higher mortality. We now know, of course, that at every single age, females survive males. So in the womb, you have far more baby boys who are miscarried. In childhood deaths, boys outnumber girls. In teenage years, with the exception of the reproductive years, when obviously more women die, understandably, but then the gap gets bigger and bigger. And we now understand, talking to our biology friends, colleagues, that it's actually something to do with our actual anatomy, and that means that probably the gap will not close. We will always tend to run parallel. We can start with our genetics. I'm sure you all know that women are a double X, men are an XY. Most of the genetic material, as I keep telling my son, is on the X chromosome. If something goes wrong with a female X chromosome, there's a backup. if something goes wrong for a man on the X chromosome where most of the material is, there isn't a backup. And you can see that in other species. If we look at birds, the letters are different, but the equivalent is male birds are YY and female birds are YX, and male birds live longer than female birds. There's all sorts of examples now from the genetics of biology. We know quite a lot also about our immune systems, that women are just better at fighting off viruses and bacteria. We saw that in COVID. So many more male deaths and male issues with long COVID, etc., than women. That means that, and I don't know whether this is the same, but in English we have this expression, man flu. And to the women in the audience, I'm really sorry, but it looks as if man flu, when they're whinging away, actually they do feel sicker than we would. But probably the most important thing is our understanding of sex hormones, and there's a huge amount of research now in this area. As you know, there is estrogen, which women have, and testosterone, which men have, and we used to think estrogen protected the body from all sorts of issues and problems, and that testosterone didn't. There is now quite a lot of evidence that actually testosterone actually increases your risk, if you're a man, of both mortality or ill health and morbidity or death. And there is a wonderful Korean study that was done 200 years ago where they had fantastic records, really wonderful archives, and somebody who analyzed these discovered that the eunuchs, who are the castrated men, they on average lived 20 years longer than the non-castrated men. So for the men here, if you want to really extend your life, there is a solution. So this is the world that we are entering into. And what kind of a world are we going to have? What are the big threats to our population going forward? And I mean, in a way, the sort of health threats. Because if we can keep healthy and active throughout our lives, then whether we are 50, 60, or 70, actually even with the current cohort, we can still be active and contributory and not a burden on our society. But if, on the other hand, these very old populations, half our population over 60, if it's going to be frail and unhealthy, that's when the world has a challenge. And we do know how to keep ourselves healthy. So let's just look at two things very quickly. Let's look at obesity, and let's look at dementia and try and work out what is happening there. So this is a really interesting study that was done in the United States. And from 1986 onwards, they started collecting obesity by a particular measure. And I want you to look. So they weren't even collecting data in 1986 in many of the states. And it runs right the way down, as you can see. When we hit the blues, we are getting up to 20%. The yellow is a quarter. And by the time we're getting into the oranges, we're over a third of the population. And if I just very quickly run this year on year through, these are single years at the end of the 20th century, and you can see how obesity just spread across the United States. Already, as we enter the 21st century, we're beginning to get states where up to a third of their population is obese, and we're going to stop this in 2009, when we have nearly all of the states, at least 20%, if not 25, or even a third of their population. People often ask me about the blue. Now, the blue is Colorado, and I once gave this talk, and somebody said, but you must remember, Colorado is Democrat, and all the states around it are Republican. And I think that's quite a nice story, that maybe the Democrats are healthier than the Republicans. I think it's probably a data error, sadly, but the other story was slightly better. We know enough about obesity. We know the damage that obesity does to our health. Higher BMI is associated with risk factors for vascular disease, with diabetes. COVID, we know that those people who died and had acute respiratory issues tended to be obese. And this is my very favorite study of all. It's a little old now. It was done about 15 years ago, but it was done in the Netherlands. And they had a very, very large sample. And what they did was they took men and women of 55, and they looked at the impact of obesity, smoking, and alcohol on whether it reduced their life expectancy or increased their disabled years. And what is very clear is that smoking and alcohol, it reduced life expectancy between 3 and 4, and it increased disabled years by roughly 3 to 4. But obesity, it only reduced life expectancy by 1 year, but increased disability by 6. That is not a good story. We have to do something about obesity. Towards the end, I'll actually show you some of the ideas that are now coming out, because obesity is going to be the scourge of the 21st century unless we do something. And another statistic is, at the moment, there are 1 billion people on this planet who are dying through lack of calories, through malnutrition and famine, starvation. And there are 1 billion people on this planet who are dying due to overconsumption of calories and obesity. It is a crazy situation. What about dementia? Very, very quickly, the dementia story is a really good story. This is just an illustrative, don't worry about the detail. It's an illustrative slide from a colleague of mine in Cambridge, where they looked at a cohort and followed it over 20 years. And during that time, they found that the age-specific incidence and prevalence of dementia fell quite considerably in Britain. Was it the fact that there was better health in the population? Was it something to do with our healthcare? Or was it something to do with education? Because we know that a highly educated, if you are a highly educated person, you can actually hide the symptoms of dementia. It doesn't mean you don't get dementia. It means that you don't express the symptoms. And then this fantastic study came out in JAMA, which is the Journal of American Medical Association. They had done exactly the same kind of study, and they had looked at a specific cohort between 2000 and 2012, and they found the same drop. But what they were able to show was that this was the birth cohort that didn't leave school at 14 in America. They left school at 15. And that 1 extra year of education carried these people through their lives. And at the population level, you saw a reduction in dementia. So that's really good news. You know, across the world, populations are getting healthier generally, and we definitely are seeing education and secondary and further education and higher education improve. So the dementia picture is reasonably good news, and many of you may have read also about the real efforts and successes in the field of genetics, really trying to tease it out. So obesity is not good, but dementia is very good. Let's start to sort of wrap this up by this question, which is how long will our children and grandchildren live for? And I'm just going to show you very quickly some statistics. This is female life expectancy at birth in 2030. Let's zoom in here. You can see, unbelievably, that within 5 years, South Korean women will have a life expectancy at birth of 90. Half the babies born are going to make it to 90. A similar study also, that was published in The Lancet. This is also in The Lancet, and this had a really big impact. This was a study which used a different database, different methodologies, and what they were looking at using the human mortality database for a variety of countries. Denmark was one of those countries. This is the birth cohort. Half the babies born in 2007, they suggest will make it to 107 in Japan. They'll make it to 104 in the UK, France, roughly the US, and in Denmark, I think Denmark it'll be 100 and 101. So that's half the babies that are being born at the moment probably are going to be centenarians. And we know there's going to be a dramatic increase in centenarians. This was done by a colleague of mine in the Institute, who we currently have 14,000 centenarians in the UK. And running the model across, we will have 1.5 million centenarians by the end of the century. In the States, there will be 5 million centenarians. In Europe as a whole, there will be 8 million centenarians. We really are pushing back the boundaries in that way. So, wrapping it up, what can we do about it to ensure that we as individuals and our children and families and policymakers, also what can you do to make sure you have healthy populations? Very much we're working on ideas around healthy living, disease prevention and care. We're trying to delay the impact of aging, and we know how to do that. Going back to the Mediterranean diet, it really works. We know exercise works, we know sleep, reducing stress. Loneliness is a real killer, so social interaction. And this is a really interesting study. This is the percentage reduced risk in developing illness just by eating vegetables. If you have 2.5 or 10 portions, you can dramatically reduce heart disease, stroke, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and even premature death. 10 portions is quite a lot. This is a day. I'm a vegetarian, and even I struggle with 10 portions, but this is what the data tells us. And this was an amazing study that just recently came out from the Global Burden of Disease study. We really can have an impact on lengthening our lives. So, if a 20-year-old man in the States, where actually 80% of the population apparently are on these ultra-processed foods, if they switched to a healthy Mediterranean-style diet, they would add 13 years onto their life expectancy. A woman would add 10 years on. But more importantly, an 80-year-old, if they were to switch, having lived that kind of a diet, they could add 3 years onto life. And we're really beginning to understand two really important things. We now know that as we change our lifestyles, we reduce cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes and stroke, the big killers of today. We know that, but we also are beginning to understand how it works at the cellular level. And that's really important. We know how our diet is affecting our cells, and of course our cells affect our aging. So, what about the new world of regenerative medicine and age retardation? What we're now saying, how much life expectancy are we going to be able to gain from the application of scientific medicine, of stem cell therapy, of 3D printing? We can print organs in the body, of the new genetics. And this is, I love this slide. This actually was done by a colleague at the University of Copenhagen in the Center for Healthy Aging by Lena Rasmussen. And this is where the cell-to-society research is really taking off. If I gave this talk definitely 10 years ago and even 5 years ago, I would have said, we're not really quite sure. But now we really are beginning to understand aging at the cellular level. And we know that stressors such as retirement or bereavement or even loneliness, we can measure the impact on our cells. And we also know that healthy life, healthy eating, exercise, good sleep, etc., social interaction, it makes us more resilient, and we can measure that at the cellular level. Fantastic array of science is now coming out. So this is the future. These are the hallmarks of aging, and the one I'm just going to quickly take you through is that one, which is all about the cell and what is happening to senescence at the cell. We know that premature aging diseases, and there's a lot of research here in Copenhagen on this, are associated with senescence. In other words, how our cells are failing us. We know that senescent cells increase with our age. We know that senescent cells are necessary to cause aging. If in mice we take the senescent cells out, they don't age. And we know that senescent cells are sufficient to cause aging. If we put old cells into a mouse, a young mouse, they start to age. And we now have a whole raft of drug therapy. There's xenotherapy, which is the development of agents which will target cellular senescence. We have senolytic, which is trying to stop our cells from dying, or in fact inducing death, of old cells. And where we have this thing called xenomorphic, which is altering the senescent cell itself, making huge, huge advances. And then we get this. This is very much available in America. You probably can get it on the web here, but I wouldn't advise that. A whole group of farmers who are bringing out all of this kind of pharma or medicine, which in theory is targeting senescences within our cells at the cellular level. At the moment, it's very experimental, but 10, 20, 30 years, I really think we will see people, the population won't be living to 100, it'll be living to 120 in the second half of this century, because we will have the pharma to support it. So let's conclude very quickly just by saying, if this is the case, what kind of a society should we be thinking about? And this is something maybe we can discuss in the questions. I'm not going to talk about pensions or long-term care. I'm going to talk about bigger things about our society. What about this? This is the generational contract. And this, every society has this. And we have it, and historically we've had it. And the idea is that if you are a parent, you have a child, you bring that child up, that child grows older, you age, and that child looks after you. And many people are now saying, we've got to change this generational contract. And we have to change it because the current cohort are not having children. In other words, they're benefiting in some ways from reducing the consumption costs and the other costs of their low fertility. And they're also benefiting from falling mortality, so they're living longer. Maybe the whole generational contract has got to be rethought, an individualization of the generational contract. A lot of thinking around that. What about generational succession? What happens when you don't inherit from your parents until you're 80, or from your grandparents until you're 80? What happens when we have a world when really important leaders are in their 70s or even 80s? How do we then get the political transfer across the life course? What happens to young people when they realize they may well be 50 before they're reaching seniority within a community or a society? What is going to happen to the way that generational succession works? And what about this? This is at Blackfriars Station in London. It's called the 7 Ages of Man. Well, if we're all going to be living to 100 or 120, are we going to have 12 ages of man? Or are we going to stretch out or modify the stages of our lives? At the moment, in many European countries, we say to young people, stay in education till you're 25. You can retire in your 50s, or if we're in France, 60. And you're going to live for another 30 years. That's 25 years of paying taxes and contributing to our society. That is just unsustainable. And people don't necessarily want what their parents and grandparents had. So we're already seeing more fluid life courses, mixing education, work, caring, retirement across the life course. And that, I think, is what we're going to see more and more of in the 21st century. And I'm going to end with this slide, because we're here in a beautiful arts centre. And it's something about what we want for our own old age and for those around us. And this is probably very familiar. This is Van Gogh's Starry Night. And he loved this picture. And he wrote a letter to his brother about this. And he talked very much about the meaning of the painting and what it meant in terms of his life. And of course, he didn't live very long. This is not the original letter. This is just a copy of the letter. But I want to read it out because I just think it's a beautiful way to think about our lives. And he said, I see the stars above as towns in a map of France. And just as we take the train to Rouen or Lille, so we take death to go to a star. And if cholera, consumption, and cancer are the boats, the buses, and the trains to the stars, so to die peacefully in old age is to walk to the stars on foot. And I think rather than this mad rush to try and get everyone to have more and more children, to stop the natural age structural change of the 21st century, it's far better that we think about having high quality, well-educated children with a good quality life, and that everyone on the planet has the opportunity to live happy, peaceful, secure lives until they are 100, and then hopefully die a peaceful death. Thank you.